Great. Hi, everyone. So the numbers have started slowing as people have joined. So maybe we'll go ahead and kick off. My name is Josh Clem. I'm the Policy Director at International Rivers. Thank you so much for joining us. Just wanted to welcome you all. Appreciate you guys all taking the time to join us for this press conference. So this on the occasion of the launch of a declaration in advance of the COP26 climate summit. And this declaration signed by now 300 civil society organizations, indigenous peoples organizations, scientists, conservationists, etc., is intended to call out the growing efforts by the hydropower industry to secure scarce climate funds to help prop up their declining sector. So the declaration has been signed by, again, 300 organizations in the span of just 2 weeks. That declaration will remain open to organizational sign-on. So we'll be sharing information on that for any NGOs who may be, or civil society groups that may be joining us and maybe haven't signed. So we've got a series of speakers who will each speak for about 3 to 5 minutes about some of the different arguments that are laid out in the declaration. So we'll go one by one through those before then opening up to a Q&A. Feel free to input questions into the Q&A whenever. You should see that at the bottom of the window. We will also take verbal questions from the audience once the Q&A actually begins. I'll give a little prep for that about how to go about doing that. If you are a journalist or a member of the media, please indicate your affiliation when posing your question. So I think with that, we'll go ahead and get started. I might introduce our speakers, I guess as a whole, just to give you kind of the rundown. So first, we'll be starting with Chris Wilkie with the Waterkeeper Alliance. Before then, hearing from Dr. Phil Fernside, from the National Institute for Research in in Amazonia, in Manaus, in Brazil, to talk about his research on methane and the greenhouse gas emissions of hydropower dams. We'll hear from Himanshu Thakkar from the South Asia Network on Dams, Rivers, and People, SANDRIP, headquartered in India, to talk about the vulnerability of the climate vulnerability of hydropower projects. Before then, turning to Fernanda Puran from the Pehuenche Mapuche tribe in Chile to talk about the impacts of hydropower dams on indigenous peoples. We are happy to have Anabela Lemos, who leads the organization Justiça Ambiental in Mozambique, that has been at the forefront of efforts to deliver or to promote clean energy and to oppose destructive dams in Southern Africa. And we have finally Paul Wilson, who's a Klamath Tribes member and also affiliated with Rios to Rivers, a US-based organization. So I know that's a lot. Hopefully we can get through it fairly swiftly so we can get into the Q&A, but I think we've got a really great set of panelists. And yeah, so maybe with that, I will turn it over to Chris to give us maybe a bit of an overview of the declaration and why we felt it was necessary.
Great, thanks, Josh. Greetings, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm Chris Wilkie with Waterkeeper Alliance, and I'm calling in from the traditional home of the Coast Salish people on the shores of the Salish Sea, the Pacific coast of North America in Washington State. And I would encourage all of us to honor the lands and the waters that we're on and the original habitants that have stewarded these lands and waters for millennia. Before we get started with our fantastic panelists, I just wanted to say a few words about the big picture about what we'll be discussing today. For years, the hydropower industry has been selling an illusion that electricity made from blocking the flow of a river with a dam, running the water through giant turbines to generate electricity is clean and green. In many parts of the world, this has led to disaster. We've witnessed tribal and indigenous fisheries destroyed, as well as commercial and recreational fishing opportunities. We see water shortages, endangered species, even localized extinctions. And we have rivers heating up and in some cases quite literally or very nearly running dry. So why then is the hydropower industry continuing to represent their product as sustainable? The answer, I believe, is money. It would appear that the hydropower industry sees a new financial opportunity as the world reckons with an unsustainable energy system based in large part on fossil fuels and the global human and ecological crisis of runaway climate change. They've done a good job selling their product as sustainable, and people actually believe, as I once did, that when you turn on a light switch, that is far better than coal or oil or gas. But as we will soon hear today, that is being challenged, and there's strong evidence to back that up. That is why this newly named Rivers for Climate Coalition is launching the Rivers for Climate Global Declaration today, to put an end to government subsidies for new hydropower dams, especially under any pretext of climate mitigation. And while many people have been at this for years, and you'll soon hear from some of them, this is day one of this declaration, which currently has 300 signers, and it will only grow. We'll present this very soon to the president and the parties of the United Nations Framework on Climate Change, the Conference of the Parties, or COP26, which begins at the end of next month in Glasgow, Scotland. And as we'll soon learn, hydropower from dams is not clean, green, or truly renewable because in most cases you must destroy something of incalculable value to get it. A living river that supports communities, cultures, ecosystems, even our very climate, which we miss now or redouble our efforts to protect. So that's it for me. I'll turn it back to you, Josh, to introduce the panelists. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so I will in turn turn it over to Dr. Philip Burnside, who I think has a couple slides. So maybe Phil, if you could share that with us, so we can learn more about how dams can actually exacerbate climate change. Thanks.
Okay, can you?
No, maybe you could launch
just
it.
A minute.
Okay.
Yeah, just a minute, trying to get it back up. There we go. Okay, it's not going to full screen here.
I think it's actually okay if you just want to get started.
Okay.
At least for me.
Okay. Well, I'm Philip Burnside from INPA, the National Institute for Research in Amazonia. First, let me point out that there's much more information about all of this at this website here on greenhouse gas emissions from dams and also other impacts of dams, which have tremendous social and environmental impacts. Now, first of all, when you flood tropical forests, like in the Balbina Dam here in Brazil, you have a tremendous emission from the trees that are left standing in the water. Really, you have to see this to appreciate it. In this dam, just to fly from the dam up to the other end of the reservoir takes a full hour in a single engine plane like this, and billions of trees. Now, that will decay in the open air and emit CO2. Of course, tropical forest dams emit more greenhouse gases than in the temperate zone. But in places like the United States, the good places to build hydroelectric dams have already been taken. And most of the planned expansion and it is in places like Amazonia, the Congo, Mekong area, tropical forest areas. Now, in addition to that CO2 you have emitted, you also have methane, which is emitted from the water inside the reservoir. This is the Tukurui Dam in Brazil. And most of the numbers you will have seen for emissions are only counting what comes out of the surface of the reservoir itself. But the water that flows downstream emits a lot of methane. And in cases like this, much more than what actually comes out of the surface of the reservoir. First of all, you have the spillways here. That water is coming out at 20 meters depth where it has a lot of methane. It's thrown up into the air and pulverized, and that methane comes out immediately. But what comes out of the turbines also is emitted. That water's under high pressure. It's just like opening a bottle of Coca-Cola and you see all those bubbles come out. The same principle, the methane comes out and it is emitted. Now, what you have here at Tukurui and other dams is a reservoir that stratifies. It divides into layers with a warm water layer at the surface that's 8 to 10 meters deep that has oxygen in the water. It's in contact with the air and doesn't have methane. Then there's a division, and the deeper water is cold water that doesn't mix with what's at the surface. And the oxygen there is quickly eliminated because the first leaves of decay will convert to CO2. And after the oxygen is gone, you can't make any more CO2. So decomposition has to stop at CH4, which is methane. It has a much higher impact on global warming per ton. So here you can see how much there is at each depth of methane. You can calculate how much is going through the spillway and the turbines. There are various publications that have these calculations. It can be more than what fossil fuels emit. Now, one of the key questions is how you convert the methane into carbon dioxide equivalents, which can make a huge difference in what you consider the impact of the dams is. So most of the publications, including a lot of my own over the years, have used the number that was used in the Kyoto Protocol, which is from the second assessment report of the IPCC, which was 21. That is 1 ton of methane has the impact of 21 tons of CO2 on global warming. And in subsequent IPCC reports, these numbers went up to 23, then 25, and then to 28 is what was used in the Paris Agreement. Actually, that does include the feedbacks. It would be 34 if you did, but the diplomats used 28. Now, the report that just came out from the IPCC, the 6th assessment report, for a 100-year time horizon, like those other numbers, it goes down a little bit to 27.2. But the problem is that we don't have 100 years to do something about climate change. It's become obvious to most people. And so a dam that has a huge emission in the first years, and much more methane and CO2 that are emitted just in the first few years, and the methane is a gas that has a huge impact on global warming in the first few years, but it only lasts for about 11 years on average in the atmosphere, whereas CO2 has a mild impact, but it lasts for about 10 times longer than the methane. So if you consider 20 years, which is the time that we have to bring global warming under control, unless we pass some really serious tipping points, it goes up to 80.8. So as compared to those earlier numbers, you're quadrupling the impact of dams on global warming. That is a huge difference. Now, the IPCC also calculated a basket of different considerations and offered a value of 50 times more impact for methane. Now, choosing between these 3 bottom numbers here is a matter of policy, not of science. If it were me, I'd go for 80.8 because that 20 years is really a pretty hard deadline for bringing climate change under control. But either way, it's much, much more impact than what people have been talking about. And you also have to count all of those different sources, not only what's coming out of the water in the reservoir itself. Now, with respect to carbon credit for this, it's also important to realize that dams are being built for other reasons. No one's building dams to get credit for the carbon. It's just a bonus that's added on top. And so the principle of additionality from the Kyoto Protocol, that everything that gets carbon credit has to be in addition to what would happen anyway without the carbon credit. That is virtually zero in the case of hydroelectric dams, because they're all being built for other reasons, either maximizing the money that can be made or geopolitical reasons for independence of energy and so forth. But in any case, it's not for the carbon credits that these are being built. So there's a strong reason that this is a waste of money in terms of how to confront climate change. What we need to do is use wind and solar, other energy sources, and not hydropower or fossil fuels. Okay, I'll stop there and we can answer questions later.
Great, thanks so much, Phil. So now I will turn it over to Himanshu. Phil, if you wouldn't mind unsharing your screen.
Right.
So Himanshu to speak about the climate vulnerability of hydropower and impacts in South Asia. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. This is Himanshu Thakkar from South Asia Network on Dams, Rivers, and People in India. So I would begin by saying that sustainable hydro, as claimed by the hydro industry, as a solution to climate change is a myth. Experience on ground show that hydropower projects act as force multipliers for the climate change impacts, thus worsening the climate crisis, particularly for the vast millions of people, and there are really millions in countries like India and other developing countries, of people who depend on the rivers, forests, biodiversity, and floodplains for their food and livelihood security. The mountains like the Western Ghats and Himalayas in the India and South Asia, where most of the hydropower projects are planned, are already vulnerable to numerous kinds of disasters, which are worsened by the impacts of climate change. This is evident from the accelerated frequency, intensity, and spread of numerous Himalayan disasters in South Asia over the last decade or so. Building and operating hydropower projects in these areas are worsening the disaster potential and vulnerabilities manifold and destroying the resilience options for the rivers and mountains dependent communities. Any claim to the contrary by the hydropower industry or the IHA will not stand to independent scrutiny, as was seen during the work of the World Commission on Dams. Hydropower projects are also hugely adversely impacted by climate change in numerous ways, including structural and operational aspects and also power generation. Big hydropower projects today are no longer viable, even in narrow economic metrics, as much better and cheaper options are available. This is evident from the en masse exit of private sector from hydro projects in countries like India. So there is absolutely no case for leaders attending COP26 to consider the hydro industry claims for allocation of scarce climate finance funds for hydropower projects in the name of addressing climate crisis. Any such allocation will be counterproductive for the efforts to address the climate crisis. It will further impoverish the impoverished mountain and riverine communities. The available scarce funds must rather be used for rejuvenation of forests, rivers, and biodiversity. That's the true way to use the climate funds. Thank you. I'll be happy to answer questions if there are any.
Thank you, Himanshu. Just checking, next we have Fernanda Puran from the Bio campaign in Chile. And Fernanda will be speaking through an interpreter, Rocio. So please go ahead. Thank you. Sigue.
Hola a todos y a todas. Mi nombre es Fernanda Purrán. Soy del pueblo originario mapuche y vivo en la cuenca del río Biobío en Chile.
Hello, my name is Fernanda Purrán. I belong to the indigenous Mapuche people and I live in the Biobío River watershed in Chile.
En el río Biobío actualmente hay 3 centrales hidroeléctricas que son Ralco, Pangue y Angostura. Las 2 primeras fueron construidas en la década de los 90, donde se inundaron más de 6.000 hectáreas de terreno indígena, provocando la afectación de las comunidades que ancestralmente vivieron ahí.
There are currently 3 dams in the Biobío River, Ralco, Pangue, and Angostura. The first 2 were built in the 90s, flooding more than 6,000 hectares of indigenous land, causing great damage to ancestral communities.
En este sentido, la construcción de la central hidroeléctrica Ralco obligó a relocalizar a 81 familias, 400 personas aproximadamente, lo que dio origen a nuevas comunidades alejadas del territorio indígena, donde la vida de las familias se transformó por completo hasta el día de hoy, ya que fueron despojadas de sus tierras y fueron trasladadas a terrenos sin aguas, infértil y sin bosques.
The construction of the Ralco Dam forced the relocation of 81 families, about 400 people, having these families to create a new sense of community far away from the indigenous territory, where to this day, the lives of the families have been completely transformed because they were stripped off their lands and were pushed out to barren land without water and without forests.
Muchas personas relocalizadas perdieron su arraigo y costumbres culturales, siendo sometidas a practicar otras religiones. Personas se suicidaron producto de daños psicológicos provocados por la relocalización, ya que los embalses también dejaron bajo el agua a un cementerio donde descansaban los cuerpos de muchas familias.
Many relocated people lost their roots and cultural traditions, being subjected to practice other religions. People also committed suicide as a result of psychological damage caused by the relocation, as the reservoirs also left a cemetery underwater, where the bodies of many families rested.
Mientras se construía la represa Ralco, un grupo de mujeres que luchaban por la defensa del río Biobío realizaron una denuncia ante la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos en contra del Estado chileno, porque el Estado chileno violó gravemente el derecho a la propiedad privada al autorizar la inundación y la destrucción de nuevas tierras ancestrales y dar inicio a un proceso de evicción forzosa en contra de las comunidades, lo que vulneró la protección especial establecida para las tierras indígenas por la ley indígena y las normas internacionales, como son la facultad de usar y gozar dichos bienes.
While the Ralco Dam was being built, a group of women who were fighting for the defense of the Biobío River filed a complaint with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights against the state of Chile. The allegation was based on the fact that the Chilean state seriously violated the right to private property by authorizing the flooding and destruction of our ancestral lands, and by initiating a process of forced eviction against the communities, which violated the special protection established for indigenous land by the indigenous law and international treaties.
La mayoría de los mapuches pehuenches, embaucados por Endesa, reconocían en ese entonces que no sabían leer ni escribir.
Most of the Mapuche Pehuenche people, enticed by Endesa, NL, the company NL now, recognized that they cannot read or write.
La construcción de la central Ralco fue respaldada por el que fue actual presidente Eduardo Frei, fue cuestionada por funcionarios de esa administración, quienes no fueron escuchados y terminaron siendo removidos de sus cargos. En cambio, otras figuras de ese gobierno mantuvieron directa o indirectamente lazos con Endesa.
The construction of the Ralco Dam, endorsed by former President Eduardo Frei, was questioned by officials of that administration. They were not listened to and ended up being removed from their positions. On the other hand, other figures of that government maintain, directly or indirectly, ties with the energy company Endesa.
La relocalización es un proceso que afecta indistintamente a toda la comunidad y a la totalidad de la cultura. La ruptura de los lazos familiares, productivos y ceremoniales constituye un impacto evidente que ya está en curso y que tiene un carácter de irreversible.
Relocation is a process that affects the entire community and the entire culture indistinctively. The breakdown of family ties, productive relations, and ceremonial bonds constitutes an obvious impact that is already underway and that is irreversible.
Actualmente la empresa china International Water and Electric Corporation, la cual es una empresa subsidiaria por Three Gorges Corporation Dam, proyecta construir una cuarta represa en el río Biobío, y aquellas familias que fueron relocalizadas serían nuevamente afectadas. Para esto, las nuevas generaciones estamos resistiendo fuertemente.
Currently, the Chinese company International Water and Electric Corporation, which is a subsidiary company of Three Gorges Corporation Dam, plans to build a fourth dam in the Biobío River, and those families that were relocated will be affected again. For this new battle, we, the new generation, are resisting strongly. Thank you very much.
Gracias.
Gracias, Fernanda y Rocio. We'll now turn to Anabella Lemos from Justicia Ambiental in Mozambique. Thank you. So, Annabella, I don't think you're muted or the audio is not coming through.
Okay, let me see.
Okay, now I hear you.
It is?
But maybe speak up a bit. It's very quiet.
Okay, I'll try. It's fine? It's better?
Maybe get closer to the microphone if it's possible.
It's better?
Yeah, a little bit.
Okay. Sorry, it's a net. In Mozambique, our state wants to build more dam with the excuse to deal with energy poverty, because only up to 40% the people have energy in Mozambique. So it's a very big deficit and lack of energy. But the strange thing is that we have one of the biggest dam in Africa, the hydroelectric Cabora Bassa in the Zambezi River. And they want to build another dam in the river, the Mapanda Nakua Dam, and actually they are trying to produce so-called green hydrogen, be exported to Europe. So they want to build a dam, telling us that will be for sort out the energy poverty, when in reality it's to be exported to Europe, that if they're going to do green hydrogen, and to South Africa if they are going to use the energy as hydroelectric. Whatever is the reason, the energy is not for the Mozambique people, and the Mapanda Dam is the one dam to start to build more dams on the Zambezi River. This will be complete destruction of the Zambezi River, will destroy the livelihood of millions of people that depend on the river to live, plus will increase emissions and will to the situation that we are already living in Mozambique with the climate crisis, because Mozambique is one of the countries that's been affected already already by many difference of climate, floods, droughts, and every other problems. So hydropower is simply not economically viable. It's not a solution for the world we live today, and think very serious and alternatives for the people with less impact and will be something favorably to the climate crisis and not make the situation worse. I pass to Joshua. I think the net is not very good, so I better stay here. And if you have any question, I'll.
Great. Thank you so much, Annabella. That was great.
Did you listen? It's fine?
Yeah, we could hear, or I could hear fine. That was great.
Okay.
Thank you. So I will now turn it over to Paul Wilson from the Klamath tribes.
Waklisad, Gawasasa Hiswaxkena. Hey y'all, my name is Paul Robert Wolf Wilson. I'm a photographer, videographer, and the chief storyteller for Rios to Rivers. A little over 100 years ago, the Klamath Irrigation Project began. Shortly following, lakes and marshes were drained to make way for agriculture in the high desert. 4 large-scale hydroelectric dams were built. Since then, water quality and in-stream flows have suffered because of the dams and agricultural uses. Salmon have not returned to the higher reaches of the watershed. Once a main staple of the diets of my tribe that has stewarded this land and these waters for over 14,000 years, we have not seen salmon in over 80 years. Further, 2 endemic fish species, Chwam and Koptu, fish equally important to my peoples in a spiritual and dietary capacity, have been pushed to the brink of extinction, continuously placed on the endangered species list. My tribe, one of the 4 federally recognized tribes that live along this river, have annually renewed lawsuits against the federal government and Pacific Corp, the owning company and operating company of the dams, for the detriment to our multiple fisheries. In lieu of updating the 4 largest dams on the Klamath River with sufficient infrastructure for fish passage, Pacific Corp and its parent company, Berkshire Hathaway, have conceded these projects, agreeing to decommission these dams. I'm so excited to share the story of this dam removal process within these international conversations, as the reasoning has been a financial decision. Berkshire Hathaway and Pacific Corp have found that large-scale hydroelectric dams are not worth cost sustaining. In addition to continuously violating the Endangered Species Act and the Clean Water Act with the toxic green algae, blue-green algae that we get annually that makes our river so toxic that we get public notices. It is also a violation of our treaty that we hold with the United States. And so within these contexts, we need to start looking at UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and how dams like these violate international law, violate treaties, and violate human rights. Thank you guys for taking time to listen to this today, and look forward to any questions you may have.
Great, thank you, Paul, and thanks to all the speakers. I think that was really good, and I think really kind of captured the breadth of concerns around hydropower and the attempts by the hydropower industry to market itself as sustainable and that it's worthy of climate funds. So I think we've heard between the contributions that the greenhouse gas emissions of hydropower in places like Brazil specifically, but elsewhere, as well as the vulnerability of hydropower to climate change, not to mention the impacts on the indigenous peoples, how hydropower has a really poor track record in delivering energy access to those who lack it, particularly in underserved areas of the world, like in Mozambique and Africa writ large, as well as the maybe kind of nascent efforts of campaigners and activists and indigenous peoples to actually restore their watersheds, because that's something that we've seen, at the same time that new hydropower is being added less and less every year globally. We are also seeing more and more dams come down. So I think as we look at that trajectory, we need to make sure that climate funds aren't effectively subsidizing a new and reckless expansion of hydropower. So maybe I'd open to questions now. I think we've got maybe some stuff coming up in the chat, some in the Q&A, maybe some coming through over Facebook as well. If there are journalists that would like to ask a question, please indicate your affiliation either when speaking or in asking your question. And yeah, please raise your hand also if you would like to speak. So there's a question in the Q&A. I won't read it out, but effectively gets to the question of if you are interested in if you want to protect your river from planned dams, kind of where would you get started? So I don't know if who might want to take that. It was a specific question to the Mekong, but I think is broadly applicable. I don't know, Chris, with the kind of Waterkeeper Alliance and your network of waterkeepers around the world, if you have thoughts on that.
Well, specifically to the proliferation of dams on the Mekong River, which is what the question was in reference to. The Mekong is the second most biodiverse river on the planet. It's traditionally home to over 1,000 species of fish. And the current plans are to string a network of dams all the way upstream into China and Laos, which will not only restrict the migration of these fish species, but also impede the sediment flow of the glacial sediment from the headwaters in the Himalayas all the way down to the delta in Vietnam. And that it will have an effect of destabilizing habitat, even destabilizing communities, agricultural communities that are built on that fertile land, could cause a displacement of millions of people eventually over time. And so really are threatening the food security and social stability of this region. And the other point I'd like to mention is the resilience that healthy rivers bring in terms of climate resiliency, basically preventing the discharge emissions of 200 metric tons of carbon into the atmosphere every year, as well as the social resiliency of a healthy river system. Where there have been healthy river communities and healthy fishing communities have fared better under the pandemic than other areas. So there's a lot of reasons to focus on that resiliency that a river provides, and a network of artificial dams and lakes is not will destroy that resiliency.
Thanks, Chris. We had a question. I'm not sure if it was in I think it was from the chat. Was a long one, but I think kind of distilling it comes to the question of how to effectively kind of stop or oppose the greenwashing of hydropower, of destructive hydropower projects. So an example of Indonesia, where where the government is using the prospects of building a dam as kind of I assume, and we see this often, kind of a prestige project, and talking up, how we're going to have this great big dam, how it's green energy, and that many and trying to get kind of political benefits from that. And that's certainly something we've seen quite a bit in our work. And I think it's important to note that that's a universal issue with hydropower, that many projects don't really stand up to scrutiny, but because they are large investments, governments quite like them to be able to show something concrete, no pun intended, I guess, to kind of justify their being in power. So I was in Guinea in West Africa a couple of years ago, and found that on the back of their new largest denomination of currency is a giant dam that the president built. And so, it just goes to show how, that the symbolism of dams can be used, but also making it, difficult to sometimes argue against projects when we know that, it's not because of their economic rationale, it's not because of the energy that they will produce, it's more about the prestige that a government will get, and also in many cases the opportunities for corruption tend to be very high with hydropower projects. So I don't know if we have volunteers who want to maybe take on the question of how to effectively oppose the greenwashing of specific projects.
Josh, I think it's important to mention that the economic part is of course has a lot of traction with decision makers, and these dams are not economically feasible. And there was a review by Ansar et al. Published in 2014, hundreds of dams around the world, that showed that the normal thing is for dams to cost much more in reality than what is thought at the time the decision is made to build the dam. And they also take a lot longer to start producing energy, which is very important for the economics. So most of these dams are not viable just in terms of money, let alone all these other impacts. And the Belo Monte Dam in Brazil, for example, cost more than double what was thought when the decision was made. The same thing happened to the dams on the Madeira River, and these are not exceptions. So that is very important. And then getting all of these other aspects out. Most people have no idea what the impacts of a dam are. You really have to see, people being displaced and all these injustices, and see the scale of the environmental impacts, the decimating the fisheries and so forth, to realize what the impacts are. They're much more than other forms of energy production.
I just wanted to follow up Dr. Fernside and say, without these international subsidies for dams to be created, or for the development of dams, they look less and less feasible. The other thing is, it's not these transnational corporations that are holding the costs of these dams. It's the communities, especially these frontline indigenous communities that rely on these rivers for the biodiversity that they provide, that are holding the real costs of these dams. Berkshire Hathaway, these parent companies, these transnational corporations are not actually paying the full costs of the dams that they're creating. They're passing the costs off to these communities, to these frontline communities and indigenous communities to hold and dissipating. They're not taking on the cost of these dams.
Thanks, Paul. And maybe one kind of final point on that. In addition to the obvious environmental and social costs that we've spoken about, the question of what happens at the end of a dam's life, those issues are not factored into the economics around dams. So we have, in the United States alone, I think something like 80,000 dams just kind of sitting there and not really for any purpose any longer. And so when those economic, those financial costs are not, included in the project assessments in the first place, then, it ends up either just sitting there and causing, prolonged harm, or, municipalities or governments will eventually have to foot the bill to the tune of millions of dollars often to actually remove some of these projects. There's one question that came in to Phil Fernside in particular. Phil, I don't know if you can see it. The question is, has there been follow-up to adjust the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism credits given for hydropower under Kyoto? How long do these carbon credits last for Annex 1 countries? Have any adjusted their numbers based on project performance? What do you think the likelihood of another carbon financial mechanism for hydropower under Paris is? Thank you for your work and presentation. So you don't necessarily have to answer all of those, Phil. And maybe others like Paul would want to weigh in as well, but kind of this question of, what happens next for, is there a new iteration of CDM coming for hydropower, or what might that look like?
Well, there's a new iteration of CDM, and exactly what is included is still being discussed. Obviously, there's a lot of pressure. We're just about to have a big meeting of the International Hydropower Association, which is a major pressure group for more hydropower. And so it's important to have this information understood. Certainly, the Clean Development Mechanism has all kinds of problems with hydropower, and it's around almost 30% of all of the CDM project or carbon credit was for hydropower, and virtually all of that is not additional. That is just allowing greenhouse gas emissions from other countries without having a real benefit for climate change, and obviously it contributes to all of these other impacts. So it's important that this not be allowed in. Even if you argue that theoretically there could be a dam that doesn't, that has more benefit for climate than the impacts and is really additional and so on and so forth, that theoretical possibility doesn't justify opening this huge loophole for all of these other dams to get carbon credit. That is, if you're trying to design a mechanism to fight climate change, the decision is not to try and tinker with the regulations on the dam. You simply shouldn't be giving credit at all for any of them.
And I'm going to add on again, just following Dr. Fernside. These dams as carbon offsets is a false solution. We are not recognizing the methane emissions that are created by dams. I'm going to post a link to an article that has imagery of the toxic algae sludge that is behind some of the Klamath dams, the reservoirs that exist. The methane that is emitted, and I'm sure that Dr. Fernside can allude to this, but is at times 85 more potent than traditional coal burning plants. And so when we're talking about possible climate solutions, we need to stop investing in things that we don't understand the impacts of yet. If we aren't ready to understand the impacts and reconcile the impacts of having these major methane emitters and funding them as clean energy, that we're going right back to that greenwashing of solutions. And we're just digging ourselves deeper into a hole that we're not going to be able to come out of.
Thanks, Paul. Annabella, did you have something? I think you had your hand raised.
Can you hear? Hello?
Yeah, if you could just speak up, thanks.
Okay. I want to add a few things. One of them is the question that is here that if a dam is not economically viable, our government push to build a dam. very easy because the companies, they're building the dam, they always make profit out of it. Second, it's a corruption government. And that is the example that I live here in Mozambique. Because the government, a few people from the elite will get money from building the dam. And then the state and the people who pay for the impacts and everything. Another issue that we raise in our 21 years of campaign is that we always talk about the impacts that dam does to the climate crisis. There's another impact also. The climate crisis, and specific on many rivers, there's enough studies to show that there's going to be a diversity of the flow of the river in decrease of water and increase of water that will make the dam not economically viable. So that's another argument and another issue that we raise because it's true. And the IPCC reports a few years ago state that building a dam, any dam in a Zambezi River, it's an economic risk due to the flow that will be changing with climate crisis. Plus, there's all other arguments that we have to fight as they come, that protects from floods, protects from droughts, and all those illusions. But there are so many that you need to raise all of them and prove with facts and science, of course, how bad is a dam. Because I always look into, if you go and tell someone how the impact of a coal power plant, people see, they see pollution, they see ugliness. But when they look into a dam, they cannot see the impacts of the dam due to the ecosystems and environmental and all that as bad as a coal power plant. So we try to make those comparison and make people see what's behind those all that. It's not easy, but after 21 years, we can see that many people now start realizing that dams are not that clean energy and solution for anything.
Great, thank you, Annabella. That's, I think, very illustrative of many of the problems that we've been talking about. So thanks again. We do have a question that came in on Facebook. Can you comment on the dispute between Sudan, Egypt, and Ethiopia regarding the Ethiopian dam filling? I would, I guess in the time that remains, I wouldn't want to tackle what's a very complicated question, but I would maybe say that we see these problems often where, and that's one of the issues that we didn't really speak to today, which is the transboundary impacts of large dams. So when you build a dam in one country where the river flows to the next, you are effectively creating a situation where of winners and losers. So not only are people downstream of dams, who may be reliant on the flows or fishing, or the river flows to flood the fields and to nourish the fields. You also have, often large, cities and countries and governments that are downstream of dams that effectively lose control over what's happening to them. So, the Grand Ethiopia Renaissance Dam question is a tricky one for sure, but I think it's emblematic of problems that we're likely to see increasingly at a time of climate change, where already water-stressed countries that depend on rivers, when they see that dams are being built upstream from them, that does present an extreme security risk to them. So, I think that's likely, the likelihood of conflict coming from these types of projects is only going to increase in the future. So maybe one last question came in from Jenny Denton at Manga Bay. asking to provide some background on the Waterkeeper Alliance, and also to, if we could provide some context on the declaration and how the demands fit historically, what sort of hearing or reaction is expected from it. Chris, would you maybe want to take that one? Okay.
Sure, I can go with that. And thanks for your question, Jenny. Well, first of all, Waterkeeper Alliance is a member of this Rivers for Climate Coalition. We are not the only members of this coalition, but the question came about our origins, which started way back in the 1960s with a blue-collar group of fishermen that were tired of seeing their river polluted and the fisheries decline, and they organized and found a way to enforce the laws to defend the Hudson River in New York and really lead to its recovery. And then that model has been replicated now around the world, and we have over 350 member programs in over 46 countries around the world. And in the context of this declaration, this is really a joint effort of this new coalition, Rivers for Climate Coalition. And I'm hoping one of our moderators can post a link to the declaration in the chat so people can see the, it will be posted on our websites as well. Later today, there's a press release going out. But basically, what this declaration is doing is putting decision makers, climate decision makers, on notice that you must take into account the full impact of dams in any decisions. What we're seeing being sold by the hydropower industry is it is essentially a branding of sustainability. They put the word sustainable in front of a dam and they try to get funding for it. And they do have some numerical calculations, but they're flawed. They are not taking into account the full climate impact of the dams, and they are certainly not taking into account the socio and environmental impact of the dams. And so the last thing we should be doing is subsidizing this if we know they aren't a true solution to climate change. And in any event, we need to make sure that there's free, prior, and informed consent by the affected communities, in particular indigenous populations. I guess I will just add that we're at a moment in history where we're basically facing three simultaneous crises, and probably more, but so I don't want to shortchange anybody, but obviously we are in the middle of a climate crisis. The scientists have weighed in through the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that came out last month, that we have precious amount of time to act quickly to limit climate change. And the way we need to do that is by targeting methane, because methane has a much faster response. And hydropower dams, particularly in the first 10 to 20 years, emit large amounts of methane. This is not the strategy we should be using. The other crises we're facing is the biodiversity crisis. I think it's 70% of freshwater species are in peril just since 1970, and dams further exacerbate that loss. And then the other factor that, of course, that we're all facing is this global pandemic, and the resiliency that river communities provide is essential. And we can't be looking at forced migrations and things like that. So we really do need to act on climate, but dams are a false solution.
Great, thank you, Chris. I think that does a good job of kind of wrapping us up. So I will stop us here. Want to thank all of the panelists for your time and your thoughts and for engaging. Thanks to all of the audience for joining us today for this hour. Please do be in touch. We shared the link to the declaration in the chat, so hopefully you should have that. Thanks again for joining, and have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, people.